So hello and welcome to Transformation Teaching's Koan of Illness interview series. A koan is an essentially unsolvable puzzle that leads spiritual aspirants to a deeper reality. Chronic illness is a koan too, and it has the potential to lead us to deeper understandings. In this series, we're bringing you the voices of people who can lead us into deeper perspectives and shed their light on this koan of illness. Any questions you might have about the interview or the topic, you can write to me at lynn@transformationteaching.com. Today, we're going to be talking with Laurie Edwards. Laurie is a patient advocate and health science writer whose work has been published in the Boston Globe, the New York Times, NPR, and other outlets. She is a lifelong patient and has written 2 books on chronic illness, Life Disrupted and In the Kingdom of the Sick, A Social History of Chronic Illness in America, which was named a Booklist Editor's Choice for Nonfiction in 2013. She teaches writing for the health sciences and writing to heal at Northeastern University and lives outside Boston, Massachusetts. So it's really great to have you back, Laurie. You and I have sort of a long history. We taught a course, designed and taught a course together at DePaul University many years ago, and you were a frequent speaker at our symposiums there. So it's really nice to see you back again. I wanted to talk to you because, in particular, well, first of all, I love your books. And secondly, because I see you as an integral thinker. An integral thinker is somebody who doesn't necessarily have to use integral theory. A lot of people who are listening in may be integral theory buffs. But somebody who has the capacity for integral thought, which is to be able to see multiple perspectives, to take a big picture on things instead of just a very, very narrow view. So integral theory can be used as a framework for understanding our lives and particularly understanding the issue of chronic illness. I use the 4 quadrants frequently in teaching, and these look at the individual aspects of illness, what's it like, for any individual person, and also at the collective and social aspects of illness. And then it also looks at the interior, what's going on inside the person who either has the illness or inside the doctor or inside of the administrator. What is their thoughts, feelings, hopes, beliefs, that kind of thing. Versus the exterior, which is the world of things, the world of bodies, the world of medicine, really, essentially. So what I really like about your writing is you maintain an awareness of all of these quadrants as you're writing, and you see these perspectives, which allows you to give this larger look at things instead of everything being an either or. And you bring up many of those that I want to go into as we talk, but you have the capacity to see a larger aspect. And I know your first book was very much about personal experience, about young people in their 20s and 30s adapting to illness. And I love that book because it foregrounded an issue that a lot of people dismiss chronic illness and think it's just for older people. But you made it very clear it's not, and you deal with that actual experience of people and younger life. And your latest book has moved into the social collective world, and you're talking about that. So I want to ask you a lot of questions about that, but I want to just start out. You talk about a lot of definitions, illness, condition, disease, disability, the healthy disabled, the unhealthy disabled. And so I found myself thinking, what is chronic illness?
Well, I think at its most basic, a chronic illness is any condition that is treatable but not curable. So what's been really interesting to see in the work that I've looked at is how that definition has remained fairly static, but the scope of conditions that can now be considered chronic has really grown over the past several decades.
Yeah, so how does that affect patients? I mean, is that a good thing or not a good thing?
It is a good thing. I mean, first and foremost, it means that many of us, myself included, who grew up with serious childhood illness aren't dying from it anymore, right? So life expectancies are longer. You could look at cystic fibrosis, for example, is a really good example of that sort of growth in life expectancy and thriving. And secondly, it really helps people join a collective community of patients And that can be really transformative and validating. It also shows the progress we've made with technology and science, that we are living longer, we are living better, we have, in many cases, more resources at our disposal, more medications, more therapies. It can also be challenging, though, because it also sort of goes against the survivorship culture that we live in, that really celebrates, quote unquote, beating illness and fighting illness, and really celebrates surviving, which of course is wonderful, but is a different situation when you're somebody who's going to live with something their whole lives that they're never going to, quote, beat, right? They're going to manage it. They're going to thrive in spite of it. They're going to try to prevent disease progression, but they're never going to, quote unquote, beat it or be fixed or cured.
Yes, I know you mentioned early on in the book that it's a big shock with people that they get it and they realize it's not going to go away. And I think the whole world of medicine is all, as you've just said, about making it go away. And then when they can't, how do you approach an illness like that?
Yeah, and I mean, it can be really challenging from a diagnostic perspective and from a doctor-patient perspective, because it's an uncomfortable space to be in when you can't always give patients the answers, and when you can't say that you're going to make them better, right? You may help, you may enhance, you may treat symptoms, but that's an uncomfortable space. We would like it to be black and white. We would like to have all the objective evidence we can, and in many cases, chronic illness doesn't work that way.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've noticed also you talk about, when you talk about the interior experience of people with illness, they come up against this attitude, and they find all kinds of things going on within them that are not addressed at all. I think you mentioned that people's identity gets whittled away little by little as they lose their jobs, as they lose their families. And you mentioned chronic pain as a particular situation in which that happens to people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think many chronic conditions are characterized by chronic pain. 25% of all Americans live with chronic pain, and an overwhelming proportion of that number are women, many of them with difficult to diagnose conditions, many of them with autoimmune diseases that can be very difficult to diagnose. And it does set up sort of this perfect storm and this is where you see that interplay of the interior and the external, and culture and technology and all of that. Because if you're a patient and you go to your doctor and you are in pain and you discuss these symptoms and you present them, and then maybe you don't get an appropriate diagnosis in a reasonable amount of time, and so your pain gets worse, but you're told that it's nothing, or it's in your head, or, well, we can't give you an answer, so it must not potentially exist, right? Then all these other parts of your identity go away because you aren't as social, you don't see your friends, maybe you are struggling at work, or you're calling out, and your professional identity takes a hit, and then your personal relationships and your family, everything changes, and your world becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. And then, that's obviously not good for your mental health either.
Yeah, right. And I like what you said too, that when you go to a doctor and you're presenting your symptoms, you're talking an emotional language, which is one they do not speak. And I thought that was a great way of defining this problem. You see it all the time. Why is it that the understanding doesn't get across? And it's because they're speaking different languages. The language of emotion is not the language of tests and numbers and things like that. So that, and what is one going to speak when you're in pain, except for the language of emotion?
Right. And, there's actually, and I talk about this more in my second book, there's research that suggests that women in particular, when they present their physical symptoms or complaints, I don't mean that in a negative way, but their symptoms, they do so in a way that contextualizes them within how they're affecting the rest of their life, right? So it is inherently more nuanced and it is more emotional. And, there is a lot of research that suggests that women in pain are not taken as seriously as men who may report similar symptoms. So it can be, it's a huge problem. And I think that the fact that pain is largely still very much self-reported and so subjective. There are some promising breakthroughs, but largely it's still, you're reporting it from what you feel, and there isn't always a lot to back that up in terms of tests and objective data. Well, then the patient has to be seen as a reliable narrator of his or her experiences, and that very often isn't the case.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. That goes back to just the whole issue of respecting the patient. And I think you bring up the difference between a clinician's observations and patient histories versus this high-tech world that we've moved into. And so the problem seems to be, in a way, getting worse and worse, this lack of communication across these quadrants. They're not matching up. And another thing I wanted to bring up that relates a little to integral theory, there's the concept of a wicked problem, which is not necessarily only an integral theory, in which the complexity is so enormous that I think you use the question of, I think, pulling on a web of some sort, and you pull a little bit of one piece and the whole thing moves, because everything is attached, everything is connected. And in a wicked problem, one of the aspects that we've already talked about is the multiple dimensions of a problem, the 4 quadrants. But there are also multiple stakeholders. And you take a lot of time in your book talking about all of these different stakeholders, the patient, the caregiver, the physician, the administrator, the politician. All these people come at it with different values and opinions and things like that. So what are some of the issues that come out of this fact that we have these multiple stakeholders?
Well, I started smiling as soon as you said wicked problem, because it's actually a framework that some of my colleagues at Northeastern use quite a bit in their interdisciplinary writing courses.
Okay.
Where they have students tackle a wicked problem from multiple perspectives and multiple majors and disciplines. So, yeah, I think it may be easiest to look at as a case example of rare disease, right? And I can look at that pretty easily because I live with one. There are a lot of different complexities that come to the table. We can be very hard to insure because many of us have genetic conditions. So they're pre-existing. They're going to follow us wherever we go. We have an average of 7 years to get a diagnosis. So that's on an average. So that's a long time to be without answers. We tend to sort of defy conventional treatments. We're very hard to spot. So we are the zebras, right? You always hear, if your hoofbeats, don't think it's a zebra, but we are the zebras. So we don't fit into easy diagnostic boxes. So we're already sort of confronting that in the exam table, in the exam room, right? When we need treatment and research, there are 30 million Americans who live with 7,000 rare diseases, which means they affect fewer than 200,000 people per disease to be a rare disease. So we are not a lucrative population to develop drugs for. There are incentives. The Orphan Drug Act has been wonderful. It looks like it's a little bit more in limbo right now. If you just this one example of rare disease, you can see how politics and science and funding and healthcare and communication in the exam room and access to care, to specialized treatments, and the ability to even get the right diagnosis depending on your access to care and your socioeconomic status. It's all one big tangled web.
Yeah. So what can a person do to take that apart? If it's because you're a woman and it's because you have a rare disease, and you have all of these various factors. And then, as I pointed out in some of these other interviews, it all falls back on the patient to manage this incredible complexity that even our system can't manage.
Yeah, and I say this with the caveat that I think it's up to the patient, or I want each patient, I should say, to feel empowered to reject things, to say no, to look for a second opinion, to do their own research, and most importantly, to follow their own intuition, right? That said, there's a lot of terrible information out there. That's a huge responsibility to put on people. And as much as it's easy to say, please be empowered to be your own advocate, it's really hard to do that when you're in an imbalance of power in a doctor-patient relationship. So I would say, first and foremost, everything starts from that relationship, right? So if you are working with someone who isn't invested in your care, if you're working with someone who it doesn't know what else to look for, what other answers to give you, then start with that. Find someone who is willing to include your narrative, right? The best physicians will see that the patient narrative is a really important and necessary and essential part of care, right? Because we don't have the same health and medical expertise, but we have expertise over our own bodies and our own states of being, and that really matters.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. You also mentioned the fact that we go out to research our own illness, and everybody does that, and nobody's going to stop doing that. But there's so much junk out there. I mean, there is so much junk out there, and then people show up in their doctor's office with nothing but junk, and it's no surprise that they get dismissed and pushed away. And I think you also suggest that doctors have a responsibility to help guide their patients in finding information.
Oh, I think that they do. Yeah. And I think a good doctor will be happy to do that, right? Because the more informed a patient is, the more empowered a patient is, the better the whole treatment plan is going to go, right? But it's true. I mean, I think one thing that I want all people who are looking out there to know is to really pay attention to who's authoring the information, right? And to look for conflicts of interest. So, if there is a site that has all these different facts about a disease, but it's paid for and developed by big pharma, then maybe look at that a little more skeptically, because there's obviously a vested interest in you going to your doctor, reporting these symptoms, and asking for a medication, right? Whereas if you were looking at a .org or a .gov site, for example, the conflict of interest is going to be different. And so I think that that's one really easy baseline place to start, which is to know who's writing it, where their perspective is, are there references, can you link out to them, are they backing things up with footnotes or hyperlinks, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, that brings me to something I heard the Dalai Lama say, which I thought was a great little quote. Somebody asked him what was the most important thing in our world today, and people thought he was going to say, love and kindness. And he said, critical thinking, which is exactly what you're talking about. We all need to learn critical thinking. And, if you look at the world, there aren't very many people who demonstrate it. There's just this, willingness to get on a bandwagon somewhere and go off in some direction without any really solid basis for doing it, or else then fly off into the other one. I mean, you can just look at the way we treat diet in this country over the last 30 years. I mean, it's one thing after another is good to have this kind of this. Yesterday, I just came across somebody who was advocating an all meat diet, and I thought, oh my gosh, now we've come completely full circle. And so I did some research, like, where does this come from? Who is saying this? How much research? And it's really behooves the patient to do that. I mean, it's really important. It's difficult. And sometimes you don't know. You find stuff and you really can't sort it out. I know my husband got prostate cancer, and he set about an integral look at his cancer, and the variety of opinions and treatments and possibilities and attitudes that people have about illness and about how it should be treated and about the medical establishment, those throw you all off too. You get in there, and is this somebody who's got a beef against the conventional medicine establishment, or is it somebody who's got a beef against alternative medicine? So, how does one do that? How clearly you've found a way, I mean, with your research, which is very, very clear, but that's a lot of expertise.
Well, yeah, and I love that you brought up critical thinking, because the class I teach the most is called Writing for the Health Sciences, and so it is an upper level writing class for students who are interested in pre-med, pharmacy, nursing, physical therapy, any of the health sciences careers, and they take it when they're further along in their career. And yes, it's a writing class, but more than anything, and what I really hope they always walk away with, and I think they do, is a sense that it's all about being a critical thinker and a critical reader before you even get to being an effective writer. And so we look at this great clip by John Oliver on like the sensationalism of reporting health information and how we get these big breakthroughs, but there's no context, right? And then I have them look at Health News Review, which is a media watchdog site that evaluates and scores health reporting out there, and they have to walk through and they actually have to assess each other's using those criteria and they their own writing. And so, I mean, I think it's those same tools are really helpful to everybody, right? Especially in the age of fake news. Like you have to be aware of what biases are out there. You have to be aware of where you're getting your information. And you need to try to think about, well, where does this fit in within the bigger context, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's not always intuitive, especially if, you're scared and you're emotional and you've just been diagnosed, or you're worried that you're going to get a diagnosis of something. And I think that the sort of the patient-centered response and the patient communities and the Facebook groups and all of that can be so helpful from that point of view, from sort of the emotional, anecdotal information sharing validation standpoint. But like anything else, we need to have a mix, right, of the anecdotal and sort of look at what do I need to accept and integrate this. And maybe you can get that information from other patients versus what is the information I need to be an empowered patient and to get the diagnosis I need.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there's a role in a way for patient organizations maybe to take this on and to impress upon each other the need for this kind of research and to value that kind of look at things instead of getting on the, I don't know what it is, the outrage banner, which is so easy to get behind because there's a lot to be outraged about. But if that's the only thing driving whatever's said, it's not enough. And the idea of a physician helping this out sounds to me like collaboration, which I think you finish your book with it, just the idea of, where's the collaboration? And it seems so important. If a doctor who has multiple patients with multiple illnesses does not have time to take one person's illness and research, especially if it's a rare disease, and research it. So the patient can actually be a great collaborator, bringing information to a person who has the context of medicine to see it in and to be able to explain it. And it seems to me they could benefit, the patient could benefit. It would be a really great benefit for everybody. But so often that doesn't happen because people are defending a belief or a sense of, well, there are doctors who believe in themselves as the only authority and let me pat you on the head. There are others who are very driven by science. If it doesn't have a scientific, basis, I'm not going to work with it. And then there are others who are actually willing to collaborate.
Yeah.
So how do you
it's amazing the difference that makes. My specialist now, I've been working with him for over a decade now, is every bit sort of a man of science. He's in a lab half the time. He's really invested in the science and the research, but he is first and foremost a clinician, and he is very much a partner. So, he can tell me things about, different antibiotics or, why I need to do this, or when I was debating or trying to figure out a way to have a child, he was very helpful in consulting with all of that and like, what are the ramifications for oxygenation and all of this stuff. But he very much looks to me to let him know how I'm doing. And when I think that my baseline isn't going as well, or when I think I need to switch my antibiotics, we have a conversation because he knows that I live in this body every day, that I know what factors external in the environment or in my life are going to make things harder or easier. And so he very much values that perspective. And it doesn't mean that what I think is always right or what he thinks is always right, but it means that we have two different perspectives that we bring together because we both want the same outcome, which is as productive a life as I can get.
Yeah, it sounds like, the basis for that kind of relationship is respect. You have respect for his capacities and he has respect for yours. And if we could just see that all across the spectrum, it would be terrific. I'm going to talk a little bit more too about attitude. You bring up that over the last 50 years, there's been a lot of change in the way we see illness and a lot of things driving that. But you talk in particular about the cult of improvement. And I think the myth of self-sufficiency. Could you say a little something about that?
Yeah, it's been ingrained in our culture since all the way back to the days of Benjamin Franklin, right? And the idea that we should be self-reliant, that we shouldn't ask for help, that hard work is the answer. And all of those things are, of course, true. Hard work is wonderful. We should try to rely on ourselves when we can, but chronic illness really throws, it goes in the face of a lot of that, right? Because we do need to depend on other people. There are times when we need, not just want, but we need to ask for help. That's what our bodies demand of us. And so I think sometimes, depending on the severity of disease and illness progression, what a productive, self-reliant, independent life looks like is much different. And I think that can be really hard in a society that's go, 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 produce, 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 achieve, achieve, achieve. I think success looks much different. One of the women I interviewed for my first book said something that has stuck with me for over a decade now, since I first started writing it, which she lives with cystic fibrosis and has undergone a double lung transplant. And she said, she used to be very high achieving in human resources and had a wonderful job and was always type A go-getter. And she said, my life now is about the relationships. And it's a different version of success and it's a different type of life, but it is no less important.
Yes.
Yeah.
I love it that you said that. I just feel so strongly that we have, and I think you have you interviewed somebody, I think it was Duncan Cross, is that the name? And he said that, it's yet another aspect of the wonderful and multifarious variations on the human theme, instead of simply a problem needing a cure. And if we can only shift to look at that, this myth of perfectibility and stuff like that, it has some partial truths, but they're very partial. We have to step outside of that. See, that applies to a small subset of situations or a small subset of people. But if we look at people as a whole, and I think you also say something like that. You say, if illness and death are seen as natural processes of living, then we look at patients differently than if illness is seen primarily as a weakness or failing. And how do we shift that picture? Because it's so ingrained in our culture. Or is it shifting? Are you seeing it change?
I think it is changing a little. But I think it is very deeply ingrained. I think especially people who don't understand chronic illness. So we know what a broken leg is, right? We know what a burst appendix is. You set the bone, you wear a cast, you're better. You take out the appendix, you recover from surgery, you go on with your life. Those are acute instances of illness, and we get those, and they're quick fixes, and that's not coincidentally very much how our healthcare system is still set up, which is to deal with the acute, right? But people who don't live with chronic illness or aren't close to someone who has it, it's very hard to see and to get that something isn't going to go away and that it can be pronounced one day and not as bad the other, that it waxes and wanes and ebbs and flows and is very unpredictable. And again, we don't tend to like unpredictability and ambiguity in life. So, I think that it is deeply ingrained, but I think that the more that people who live with chronic illness have their stories out there, I think the more that that we can bring sort of the objective science into it. And I think that, in decades to come, that will happen a little bit more. I think that helps us fight back against that ingrained idea that, if you have an illness, you're weak, or it's somehow your fault. Or if you were just stronger, then your pain wouldn't be a 10, it would be a 2. What's wrong with you? So, it is pretty popular.
Yeah, it seems to me like it's the next big social wave that needs to be addressed. We had women's rights and we had race rights and we had multiple things like that. And I remember at DePaul one time, many years ago, trying to introduce chronic illness as a diversity problem. And people looked at me like, oh, how odd. But really it is. It's another group that's discriminated against. It's another group that has prejudicial attitudes directed toward it. And it's so, I think just like with other issues, people didn't realize they were doing that to women, for example. They didn't realize the number of attitudes that were just implicit in our society until women started making a big noise about them. And at first it was like, oh, no, I'm a nice person. I don't do that. But gradually, you're learning that it's part of the culture and people automatically do. And I think the same thing is true of illness. There's just an attitude that people have. And again, the point you make that 50% of people in this country have a chronic illness, and we're not just talking hay fever. They have something serious going on, and yet they don't speak about it. Other people don't speak about it. It isn't known. So it does, like you say, when people start telling their stories, and we see it's all around us, that everybody around us, 50% of those people are really struggling with something. That it isn't all just everybody gets to do what they want, and if they just forge ahead, they're going to have the perfect career and the perfect relationship. And no, it's harder than that.
Yeah. Well, and your most recent comments make me think of one thing that I always say that I've learned from writing my second book, which is not what I thought it would be when I started out writing it. I thought I was going to write truly a social history of illness, and what I ended up writing was really a history of activism. And you can sort of pull this invisible thread through, the civil rights movement and that its impact on the women's health movement and the women's health movement's impact on, or sort of, concurrently the disability rights movement too, right? And then the sort of early breast cancer activists and the early HIV/AIDS activists, and all the way up to modern day patient advocacy and virtual advocacy and social media and all of that. But what was, really interesting, if we look, for example, at the disability rights movement, it really took off and really pushed through substantive, like life-changing change when all of these people with different disabilities could sort of put those differences aside and mobilize together. And that's when you saw the big sit-ins and, in the early 70s. And that's when change really started to happen. And I think what is a challenge with chronic illness is that it is one big umbrella term, but there are so many disparate diagnoses and vested interests. And, there are people who are more focused on, how the environment is affecting the emergence of autoimmune disease. And there are people who are more focused on how can we provide support and social services to the people already living with these conditions and things like that. And all of those are valid and worthy, but I think they make it really hard to mobilize as one big group.
Yeah, I think there's a parallel. We see that in politics where people are so one issue oriented, and they won't let that one issue be a part of something larger. It has to take center stage, and it just keeps us continuously fragmented. And things that could help the whole in various areas of life, we just fight ourselves. It's like the fingers of one hand fighting with each other. But you call it slacktivism now, that we have somehow the idea of a group of people of chronic illness working together to make it better for everyone with chronic illness just doesn't seem to be there.
Yeah. And I don't know if that will happen. I have hope that it will, but I think, if there was ever a time that would have happened, it would have been in the ramp up to healthcare reform. And we certainly saw a lot of mobilization and a lot of advocacy. So I'm not in any way saying that didn't happen. But it wasn't necessarily, at least from my point of view and from what I observed, sort of that unifying, mobilizing turning point.
Yeah, and aside from the fact that it's multiple illness, what do you see? Why didn't people get behind that? I mean, it is a surprise. It is a big surprise that there wasn't. I didn't see people complaining or realize. It's like they don't realize it actually impacts their own life, because when it gets really close to us, that's when we're going to get activated. But it seems like people don't. I think even a lot of people with chronic illness don't identify themselves as disabled, that's a label they don't want to put on themselves, or they actually don't see themselves that way. And so a movement for disability to them, and I'm just wondering about these self-perceptions and where they fall in all of these definitions. Why is it that a person with chronic illness would not see themselves as disabled?
Well, I think first off, it even within one condition, there can be such a range, right? That a condition that I might have and someone next to me on the street might have may truly be disabling to another person and may not be to me because of severity and disease progression and access to care and all of those. So we can sort of put that out there as a given. But I think it's very similar to the idea that people think chronic illness belongs to the elderly, right? I think when they think disabled, they think sort of the obvious cases of physical disability. So someone in a wheelchair, someone with a walking stick and a visual impairment, someone who's using a service dog, whatever the case may be. We have these very fixed ideas of what physical disability is. And again, chronic illness and disability, they overlap in really compelling and interesting and important ways, but not in always obvious ways. So I think that a lot of times chronic illness is invisible illness, so you can't see the disability even if it's there.
Uh-huh.
So I think that's a big problem. And I think that it is hard for people who maybe have watched their health deteriorate and who have tried all kinds of different things and who've been sick for a very long time to sort of upgrade their label from chronically ill to disabled, right? Because that, again, maybe part of that idea that we think the rest of society has about what it means to be disabled, the same stereotypes that people with physical and other types of disabilities already live with, that we're ascribing all of that baggage to ourselves too then, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Be part of it.
And as you were talking, I was thinking about the idea of long term. Really, it's that can wear you down. If you've had an illness for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, it doesn't have the same, well, it has the same horror. I don't want to say it doesn't, because it really does. You don't lose that feeling of not wanting to have it, but it doesn't have the shock, I guess, that it has at the beginning. So when a person who is experiencing some other kind of problem and it happens, they're mobilized and they get out there and they do something. But when you've tried various things over many, many years, I've tried various types of activism in my life, mostly found them extremely stressful and difficult, with very little result. Maybe because I was ineffective, but also maybe just because moving any of these giant institutions or belief systems is so difficult that any one of us is a drop in the bucket. I mean, together we can be a bucketful. But
right.
So I think, and also people with illness, they're tired. They're busy. They can't, they go to work and then they come home and they got a whole life of illness stuff to deal with. It's not they get together with friends after work and have a great time.
Right. Yeah.
So where do you fit activism in here?
Yeah, and I mean, many times the answer is you can't. You're just doing the best you can to get through the day, right? So, I think it's also really important, for as much as we talk about patient empowerment and patient advocacy and all those things, that we don't turn this around and put the onus all on the individual who's going through a lot and dealing with a lot to be responsible for making all the change.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think that's another thing that has to happen is we have to realize how really burdensome people's lives are when they get an illness. We're blithely, for the most part, unaware of that. Okay, they don't feel well, or they have this or that or the other, but they don't realize what comes with that. I divide illness sometimes into what I call trauma and project.
Mm-hmm.
You've got all the emotional stuff going on, but you also have this huge project that just gets dumped in your life. All the research that we've talked about, all the treatments that you mentioned going, you go into this kingdom of the sick. You leave the kingdom of the well is one thing, but the kingdom of the sick is another. So actually I wanted to talk a little bit about that title because I think it's so interesting. It captures this. So to say a little bit about how that came about and how you see it.
Yeah, well, the idea for the second book actually came a long time ago when I was teaching a freshman writing course on constructions of health in literature. And we read Susan Sontag, we read Illness as Metaphor, where this quote is from. And, originally I wanted, the other part of that quote talks about the night side of life. And that's originally in my head what I wanted to call this book. And it sounded very lyrical and like poetic and publishers are like, nobody is going to know what that means. And so, we settled on the In the Kingdom of the Sick, and I was so happy with that at the end, because I really feel like, we do leave one world. We leave the world of the healthy in the expected and the predictable, and then we travel. And some of us may kind of go back and forth depending on how our illness goes. But really, once you've got your passport stamped, like you're not really ever fully leaving. And I think that it really encapsulated that binary, right? That there is this whole other world that defies easy categorization and easy fix-it cures. And more and more and more of us are going to be part of that.
Yeah, and if we're not part of it as a patient, we're like, most of my life has been as a caregiver. So when somebody gets sick, it's not just them who enter this kingdom of the sick, it's the people who care for them, who also find themselves with their lives changed and their concerns very different from what they were before.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, it's incredibly stressful from a sort of a basic logistics of running a household to loss of income, to how does the well spouse manage all of his or her responsibilities while taking up all these increased ones. I mean, it's incredibly complicated.
Yeah, and so just what continues to shock me is so little is known. I mean, even in my situation, my son's been ill for more than 30 years, and I've, clearly been through many of these changes in attitudes and movements, evolution of medicine and everything. But it's still astounding to me how few people really get it. There was a movie put out called Unrest by a woman named Jennifer Bria. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's about ME/CFS, and people, because I asked them to, went to see it, and they were like, "Oh, wow, I had no idea," and so yes, the more stories get out there, and the more really well done ones like that movie, we really, really need that kind of information. But of course, it's difficult because people don't want to show themselves. They don't want to be the poster boy for chronic illness, or they don't want people to see them. I think that's another reason it's so invisible. They don't want people to see them at their worst. Well, or they can't see people because the onslaught of activity is too much. And so when someone goes out and they actually meet somebody, they're at the peak of their functioning. They've saved up for this energy to get to this doctor's appointment or this. I think it's, one of the real ironies is people look better in the doctor's office because they've geared themselves up and they've done what they have to do to hold themselves together for that hour or so. And then they go home, and weeks, months could go by before they have that kind of energy again. And that's just not seen. But who wants to show themselves? I mean, I applaud the people on that movie who were willing to be seen in their most difficult, experience. Probably then not even most difficult, because they were able to speak, and to be part of that movie. So
it's incredibly hard to make yourself vulnerable, and when you're feeling very badly, you're most vulnerable. And I have colleagues who I have worked with for years who, until they happened to hear me on Fresh Air a few years ago talking about my second book, didn't even know that I had an illness. And they were like, "Well, we've never seen you sick, or you don't look sick, or you don't." I'm like, "Well, nobody sees me when I'm sick, because when I'm that sick, I don't go anywhere. Like, it's okay. You didn't need to know. You didn't need to, parse it through the tea leaves. Like, it's something I bring up if there's a reason that I need to. I don't hide it. I'm not ashamed of it, but it's not going to come up in everyday conversations. And in my case, if I'm really sick, like I'm not breathing, so I'm not going anywhere. But when you only see people on their best days, it's very hard to know all that goes on behind the scenes. So.
Yeah. It's really an interesting problem. I mean, how to take an experience that people don't want to share and make it visible. So I applaud anybody who's got the courage to come forward in any way and add to this body of information that we've got. So I wanted to ask you about this course that you have, Writing to Heal, because that's really brings all this into the life of the person who's actually trying to heal. So what do you do there? What do you teach?
Yeah, so it is a course that I developed a couple of years ago for an interdisciplinary minor for health and humanities, and it is, I'm like grinning because it is my favorite thing ever to teach. I love it. It's very difficult. It's a tough class, but it is all about how expressive writing can help process physical or emotional trauma. So it is an elective, it's a self-selected course. So students come in there because they have something they want to work through. And we use a great book written by Louise DeSalvo on Writing to Heal, which I recommend anybody pick up and can use on their own. And we do a ton of in-class writing and in-class prompts to get people comfortable writing through the difficult stuff. And we have some great frameworks we use for types of healing narratives. It's very much a community-based course. We have a community agreement that we set up as a group at the beginning that outlines our expectations for confidentiality, respect, privacy, collaboration, accountability. It is very much an environment where a lot of difficult stuff is being written and talked about and shared, so the door, people can always come and go if anything is too upsetting. But it is amazing to see the growth in these students that they have over the semester when they're willing to put their story out there and work on it and refine it. And, we always say we're here to grow as writers, right? First and foremost, we're not here to judge or critique each other's life experiences. But in the process of growing as a writer and paying attention to all those writerly moves, they're really processing their story. And some of them physically look different. They look lighter. They have conversations with relatives they haven't been able to have in decades. They sometimes take their essays and they share them with family. And so it is very freeing, but it's very tough work. And I admire each of them so immensely for being willing to take the plunge. And for the environment that they help create and the community that they give each other so that they're comfortable sharing. But it is amazing. And it's sort of the difference between just like journaling and writing down what happened versus like processing and adding reflection and insight into sort of like how can you grow from that or where can you go from here. So, it's a fantastic class, and the book itself is really, really helpful. So it has been the biggest transformative experience of my teaching career.
Oh, wow. I think that's beautiful. Maybe.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, thank you for the recommendation. While I'm saying that, I also want to make sure that people know that we will have under this video access to Laurie's books, both of which I really recommend highly. The one for young people, getting life disrupted, getting real about chronic illness in your 20s and 30s, and then your latest book, In the Kingdom of the Sick. And so we'll put those there. And I think you have a blog as well, right?
I do. I did. It's still up there. My website itself is pretty current, but I haven't been blogging as much. But yeah. I might pick it back up. But
I know. It's hard to keep up with everything. There's no way to do it all. Yeah. So I just wanted to touch into a comment you make, I think that's at the end of your first book, about the difference between, I'm going to find it so I can say it correctly here. Okay. Oh, when you say being well has nothing to do with being healthy. So can you?
Yeah. So, I remember so distinctly writing that towards the end, like getting to that point where I was like, this is what it all boils down to, which is that you can still have fulfilling relationships and you can still have a career. It might not be the exact one you envisioned, but you can still make reasonable accommodations and find a way to have a rich, productive life and be your own advocate and accomplish what you want, even if you have chronic illness. That like you don't have to be quote unquote healthy to be well, because well means what? Contentment, productivity, peace, and you can find those things.
Yeah, I often think of an artist can paint on a huge canvas, or they can paint on a very, very small canvas, and that doesn't have anything to say about the quality of the life. Now, there are some people who can't even be productive. I mean, they are beyond that, but I always think of they can appreciate. I mean, if we didn't have somebody to appreciate art or to appreciate music, we'd never write music. So
Right.
so even taking those kinds of things and seeing that life again, life takes many forms, and this is one of those forms. And I think we don't have to celebrate it or not celebrate it, but we just have to experience it. I like that comment by your interviewee, Duncan Cross, about it's it's a wonderful variation on life.
Yeah, exactly. And what is a rich, full life for one person will look very different from somebody else's, and they're all as worthy. So
Yeah. Well, thank you. This has really been helpful. Once again, I recommend Laurie's books, and I look forward to spending more time with you. Maybe we'll chat again.
great. It was great to connect with you again. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.